We are living through turbulent times. From Europe to the United States, the political establishment has been shaken by earthquakes from Brexit to Trump.
We will make America great again.
The sun has risen on an independent United Kingdom.
Ballot box revolts that reflected a mood of anger and a demand for change, and left traditional politicians struggling for answers.
There's no hiding the fact that we wanted a different outcome.
They're calling it populism, but just what is 21st century populism? And with elections across Europe in 2017, how far could it go?
We're living through the end of one world and the birth of another.
Populism is a demand for the people to be taken seriously. They are being asked to live with a new world that is not of their own making.
Those warning bells have been ringing for a long time, but the political fallout of it hasn't come until quite recently. And therein lies the shock.
Many politicians will throw around populist almost as an insult. Oh, you're just paying to popular demand. But that is in many ways democracy.
Populists recognise genuine social tensions, perhaps that have been simmering for some time. They seize upon these and they seek to drive and deepen cleavages in society.
I don't think traditional parties are dying, but they struggle to find the answers, because it might mean they have to go down also a populist path, which is very dangerous.
How has this wave of modern populism built to a crisis point, where the political certainties of generations are collapsing across continents?
The UK has voted to leave the European Union.
The seeds have been growing for decades in a rapidly changing world.
There's a lot of fear, and I think people is right to be afraid, because a lot of things are going on in the world that are overwhelming. And it all goes down to what is called globalization.
The changes in our economy have been taking place over many decades. And for some people, this has meant that they felt left behind.
In a world increasingly interconnected by trade and culture, traditional blue-collar jobs in mining and manufacturing in Europe have disappeared, and communities have changed rapidly.
All the studies show that people who tend to support populist parties are afraid of the effects of globalization. They feel like the environment is changing very quickly. They don't recognize the place where they used to live. It is far more difficult to have a stable work, a stable income, and there's a lot of fear around that I think is fair.
They have seen that the world has moved on in a way that they are not comfortable with, but also crucially that they did not consent to.
The levels of economic inequality have continued to increase for the last 40 years or more. And they've got to a point now where people don't even know how unequal their own societies are.
Over the last 20 or 30 years, but particularly in the last decade, changes have occurred across developed democracies that have benefited some people, in some cases greatly. Some people have done really well over the last 10, 20, 30 years, but other people have been left behind.
You've got a very large number of people who are living in a very precarious way.
In America's Rust Belt, just as in Europe's industrial heartlands, the loss of traditional jobs coincided with a disconnect from a political class who had power over people's lives. That fueled a growing sense of us and them on which populism has thrived.
You find that the politicians, whether they're left or right, almost look alike, and they talk the same way. These individuals have been, to some extent, taken away from the everyday experience of those kinds of communities. They haven't really been absorbed and haven't worked alongside other people who are not like them.
Over particularly the last 20 or 30 years, we've seen the rise of the career politician. People who spend their entire working lives, or at least the vast majority of their working lives, engaged in some aspect of professional politics. And so are seen as being out of touch with the common people.
Politicians on the left and centre have struggled to connect with the new mood of populism.
You could put half of Trump supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables. Right? The racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it. And unfortunately, there are people like that.
She didn't just simply say that Trump is wrong, but she basically pathologized his supporters by describing it as these deplorables. And that was a very powerful statement, because what that communicated was the idea that these people are somehow morally reprehensible. They are almost, kind of scum.
While my opponent slanders you as deplorable and irredeemable, I call you hard-working American patriots who love your country and want a better future for all of our people.
Everybody I talked to in Washington who was either a member of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, or political activist, or in an NGO or a think tank, every single one of them hated Trump. Every ordinary person I talked to, cab drivers, people in shops, people in restaurants, even if they didn't necessarily agree with Trump, they had a sneaking admiration for him.
And there has been a growing educational divide, even within families.
The way that the universities now work, higher education now works, is actually to socialize people into an outlook that's almost the cultural opposite to the one they were born into. Young people are socialized to reject the values of their parents, certainly the values of their grandparents.
Those with college degrees and university educated have very different views when it comes to things like immigration and race and a whole host of other things from those people with fewer educational qualifications.
Are you trading? Are you taking me? Are you asking me for trading? Right!
The main catalyst for the current wave of populist anger was the 2008 financial crisis.
The 2008 financial crash accelerated changes that have been taking place over many decades.
There are no quick fixes.
I'll continue to closely monitor the situation in our financial markets.
You also have events such as the global financial crisis that causes the reputation of the entire establishment to be damaged. How could our leaders, how could our politicians let that happen? That's true across the world.
The crisis of faith in politicians was exacerbated in the UK by the expenses scandal in 2009, with MPs being portrayed as greedy and corrupt.
The expenses scandal and corruption scandals that we've seen just confirmed that niggling feeling that people have had for a long time, that the distance between them and ordinary people and the political elite had become a really profound gulf that couldn't be bridged anymore.
Those political elites who are supposed to represent their aspirations and try to solve their problems have themselves been shown to mislead, take countries into war on the basis of false premises, have been shown to be very corrupt.
He's a liar!
Distrust in politicians has been simmering since the 2003 war in Iraq.
Tony Blair has now become the global enemy number one. The whole sort of undermining of the kind of politician as liar, politician is untrustworthy, and so on, has come at the very same time as many of these other kind of things which have not delivered economically and financially to people.
The 9/11 attacks on New York, followed by 2 decades of terrorist atrocities, have increased the sense of insecurity on both sides of the Atlantic, fueling the fear of the other that feeds a populist narrative.
The people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
Citizens just feel, my government can't protect me anymore, and that creates a real sense of fear and insecurity, and it can also create a sense of anger.
Turmoil that followed the Arab Spring uprisings in 2011 had a ripple effect that played into the rhetoric of populism.
The war in Libya The intervention in Libya, which has made a large number of refugees from that country, but also then the knock-on effect in Syria, that has created a wave of refugees in Europe. That has had a very, very large impact on the rise of the right.
And in communities already under pressure, it has been easy for right-wing politicians to exploit an already well-established fear.
There has been, if you like, this convention among the political classes in developed democracies that they will not address issues such as race and immigration for fear of antagonising, for instance, racial tensions or other problems along those lines. This is, however, an area where populist parties and populist candidates have been able to find a gap in the market, if you like, a niche, and exploit it.
But the refusal by centre-ground politicians to engage on immigration left the door open for the rise of populist parties like UKIP. Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, Marine Le Pen's Front National in France, and Geert Wilders' Freedom Party in the Netherlands have all exploited the same vacuum.
There is a lot of Moroccan scum in Holland who makes the streets unsafe.
For a lot of people, immigration and the problems that they have with immigration isn't necessarily driven by prejudice or racism, but by the fact that the world that they live in no longer resembles the one they were born into.
The powerful mix of fear and anger exploited by populist parties has only been inflamed by social media.
The internet generally, and social media specifically, has only helped to accelerate the growth of this populist movement. You can engage with the entire world, and you can do it 24 hours a day. You can speak and say things that perhaps you would not be so comfortable to say to somebody to their face.
Establishment voices in journalism and politics have been drowned out as issues like Brexit and the US presidential election have been debated with unprecedented anger and vitriol.
Social media provides a platform for populists to speak directly to their people.
You have an echo chamber, and so you have a lot of people speaking to each other about the same thing, all agreeing with one another.
We're taking the power back! American lives matter, that's what they should say.
Decades of globalization, an increasing distrust of the political elite, the fear of terrorism and the fallout from war across the Middle East have all combined with the devastating impact of the 2008 financial crisis to create the perfect breeding ground for populism.
There's a lot of research that shows that, historically speaking, a big economic upheaval, such as the Great Depression or such as the global financial crisis, will produce, a certain number of years afterwards, a rise in populist movements.
We're seeing people taking to the streets in protest. They are rising up against the government through the ballot box. They are saying, here is my voice, it's time to be heard.